Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History Five Podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Joshua Bowen and Dr. Kipp Davis. I have the links to their YouTube channels in the description below, tagged. So if you're not subscribed to their channels already, you can click on those tags and subscribe now. And that being said, Joshua and Kipp, thank you both for joining me today.
It's good to see you, Jacob.
Having us back on.
You know, I really like your intro music. It makes me feel like I'm getting ready to watch an episode of Stranger Things. It's pretty great.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, we're going to be talking a bit about the Book of Genesis and its use of Mesopotamian literature. And I think I'd like to first start off with the Enuma Elish. We've talked a bit about Enuma Elish parallels to the Book of Genesis before. I kind of want to go back and discuss it some more. And again, you know, as you both know, like we had the whole Billy Carson controversy, and he's like, oh, there's multiple word for word agreements between the Book of Genesis and Enuma Elish. And now there's a lot of parallels, but they're not that exact.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's. Sorry, go ahead, Kipp.
No, you go.
No, I think that's fair, and I think it's important, probably, in this kind of discussion. You know, it's one thing to, it's one thing to say, like, look, you know, Genesis is clearly utilizing an earlier mythology, and you know, if it's a little more of a relaxed atmosphere, saying something like, you know, you can see how it's being copied or something like that. But unfortunately, I think in this particular instance with Billy Carson, it was probably in a context that required some precision, and it just wasn't realized that it needed to be that a little bit more precise, because he was going to be held to that. And so I do think it's, you know, we should nuance this to say that no, there are not large swaths of text, you know, that copy over. But I also want to say, and we can get into this in greater detail, who gives a fuck? And I mean that, you know, somewhat poignantly there. You know, nobody doubts the importance of the Enuma Elish utilizing the Anzu myth and the relevancy of that. But you would be hard pressed to find large sections of text in the Enuma Elish that copy the Anzu myth, or going to the later text of Aaron Isham, you would be hard pressed to find large sections of the text that borrow from the Enuma Elish directly or copy it over like that. But that doesn't matter. Like, I feel like this is a litmus test that is, I think, being foisted upon the text that need not be there. In other words, it's not a win for a Christian apologist to say, look, the storyline, it's very different, or you know, the point that's being made is very different, or look, there aren't these large parallels in the text. You know, yeah. So it's just, I don't think it's the flex they think it is.
Or as if we the way to go about doing this is just counting up everything that we understand to be similarities, and then those that are differences, and deciding whether there's a dependency on which one outweighs the other. It's just not the way to go about doing this.
I think what doesn't help is you have individuals, pseudo historians like the late Zechariah Sitchin, who have massively exaggerated the Mesopotamian parallels to the Pentateuch. And again, apologists was just mentioned a moment ago. Yeah, apologists will take advantage of those mistakes, which are either deliberate or accidental, depending on who it is and who's doing it and the motives. And they'll say, you see, that person screwed up over there. That means you're all wrong. They'll put everybody in the same coat.
Yeah. And the thing is, just very briefly, I feel like we come to this discussion sometimes, again, assuming that there are going to be things that are not posited on the in the argument, right? Like, if you do an experiment, if somebody says that, Jim was killed with an invisible gun, and then, somebody comes along and says, well, look, we don't see a gun. So, your hypothesis couldn't be right. It's like, well, my hypothesis doesn't predict that you'll be able to see the gun. So it's not really a meaningful thing to critique. And so I think in these contexts, people have been doing they call it the Bible babble comparison for centuries now, since we discovered the Mesopotamian texts, right? The Akkadian and Sumerian texts. And, there's debate still continues on many of these things. Yet, I think on the whole, what I see happening is people on both sides of this discussion. I'm more familiar with apologists doing it on one side, but will try to focus in on certain singular things that they consider to be problematic, and then, as you say, sort of expand those out to imply that this then broadly applies everywhere. And it's just not the case. There are far too many areas of overlap between the Hebrew Bible and a whole host of different genres of text from the ancient Near East that, trying to draw this line of demarcation, I think it's unnecessary for anybody, really.
When the text was first translated, they were quickly amazed by how the flood myth in Mesopotamia paralleled the book of Genesis so well. You got a guy building an ark. He's got a family. And he's got animals, and they're being loaded onto the boat. And although it's not everything lines up, there are differences and stuff like that. Multiple gods at play here, not one, but multiple. One warning somebody of the flood, and you got the other either letting it happen or causing it to happen, or having another cause it to happen. But in any case, you got multiple gods at play here. But it's still it feels like largely the same story that's been copied, edited, and streamlined.
Sorry, go ahead, Kipp.
No, I was going to say, and I think what we see is some evidence of that, just in terms of how widespread this story was. We have multiple, even before you even get to the biblical text, you've got multiple versions of this story working its way forward through history in different times and different places. It's being picked up and adapted and worked into other pieces of literature, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's not it's worked into the story from earlier sources about this flood story. It's an ongoing process that you see just carried on in the biblical text, and I think that's probably why a significant portion of why scholars were so keen to see the parallels between these texts. But then it also became very exciting in that now you can place some of this biblical literature within a stream of texts and traditions, where it kind of locks in.
Yeah, and I think that when you consider the things that are different in the biblical flood story, think about the challenges that the writer, the priestly writer, or the Judean scribe, whoever it is that's putting this together, or whatever school is putting this together, the challenge that they're facing with the Atrahasis story, or with Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, is that you've got, as you pointed out, Jacob, multiple deities, and you've got a deity that is specifically called out as having done something evil. So Enlil has been evil in sending the flood. And then you've got Enki or Ea, who is coming to the rescue of humanity. And so the Hebrew Bible has to deal with this story that has a good God doing something and a bad God doing something, and yet has to somehow, in the internal frame of reference of the narrative, meld these two together. And I think does it brilliantly.
Yeah.
Because, and Kipp, if you want to, run with this, but I mean, like, thinking about how the text opens in Genesis 6, you have the first 4 verses that talk about, the sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim. And then starting in verse 5, the hearts of man were, I can't remember the exact phraseology, but it's like, the thoughts of the intents of man's heart were only wicked continually.
Only wicked, yeah.
And it's, in other words, the writer is going to some really great lengths to say it's not the God that is being evil here. Remember, in the Mesopotamian story, the consistent reason that the flood is sent is that mankind is overpopulating, even though they're doing something that the gods have created them to do. They're making too much noise. This is the theme that we see in the Enuma Elish as well, both with the original gods that are formed, and then with Marduk himself. And yet here, the story in Genesis lays the blame squarely on humanity, and God, the singular God who sends this flood, has to do it. It's a necessity because mankind is so wicked, and yet he is at the same time the savior deity who comes along and saves the 8 souls. So I again, and I'll shut up. Sorry. Early on, everybody gets really excited when you find a text or a group of texts that have these clear parallels. And what do you focus on? You focus on where they connect, where they overlap. We all do this. This is how humanity works. And you can tend to have that pendulum swing one way a little bit too far, right? And you start focusing on all the overlaps. And then, eventually the pendulum swings back a little bit, and it's like, well, but, the differences are also important, but that doesn't mean that there aren't the overlaps, right? It just means that the focus has shifted. So anyway, sorry.
Yeah, there's still there's still echoes of some of these themes too in the text that you don't necessarily see or you necessarily hear right away. But I think are still there from the old flood story. It was the flood was sent because people were making too much noise. The gods couldn't get any sleep anymore. It's interesting that in the biblical story, Noah's name literally just means comfort, rest, right? And it's turned, as Josh pointed out, it's turned the din of just activity in the text into this much more moral, ethical problem that needs to be resolved. But it's interesting to me that the resolution for that seems to be coming back to this idea of rest. And there's a play on words in the text too, in verse 6. When Yahweh is sorry, when he relents, the verb that's used there is v'yinochem, which is calling back right away to this figure Noah, to the one who's going to give everyone rest. So, like, the story in Genesis is very much in conversation, in the clear places, right, where that we can see it in the flood story, but even in some of the in some of the folds, and in some of those places which don't strike us right away as obvious.
When we look at apologists, and one of the things that they often try to do with the Book of Genesis is they try to mix it in with modern science. It's like, oh, well, God created humanity through evolution. That's the ticket. And then when you start looking at it in like the lack of archaeological evidence for the things it says, the unrealistic things it says in the text, and on top of the fact that it's similar to Mesopotamian myths, very similar. It's like, okay, I know some will try to say don't use the word plagiarize, but if this happened today, it would be that. And so you got plagiarism going on, you've got lack of evidence going on, you have things in Genesis that contradict science going on. You can't harmonize any of this, and it just shows that it's just not real history.
And I think that's important to recognize when we're coming to ancient texts more in general, or more generally, when we're trying to ascertain like what is it that the writer is trying to do, or the school of writers is trying to do. So, one of the things that we've kind of had an idea about, but somebody in 2012 or 2013, I think, Chen, I think was his name, wrote a book on when did the flood tradition develop in Mesopotamia. And there's an apologetic argument that they'll say, okay, look, we'll grant you that these stories sound the same, right? Or there's overlap between them. But it's because just like if you have two people or three people that witness the same car accident and they give their accounts, one might give the accurate account and one might give, a distorted account, but they're going to sound the same, but it's because they're describing the same event. So there must have been this flood that happened that they're remembering or describing. The problem with this is that the Mesopotamian flood tradition seems to kind of come in, not all of a sudden, but in a relatively short span of time, in the beginning of the second millennium. That's when we get evidence for it. That's when we start to see it. And then we have texts that have that, like the Sumerian king list, for example, has mention of the flood tradition. And we have manuscripts of that from the Ur III period, from the third millennium, and yet they don't contain this line about the flood or this earlier section of the text. And so anyway, I think we've got pretty good evidence that the flood entered into the Mesopotamian literary tradition in the beginning of the second millennium BCE, and did so in Sumerian and in Akkadian. And so, this idea that it happened in the middle of the third millennium, or it's like Younger Dryas or something like that, you would have to try to wrestle with why it is that we have literary texts, specifically literary texts that contain this flood tradition later on, that don't mention a flood at all until it comes into the literary tradition, somewhat at the same time in the second millennium. I think that's an important point to make.
And when you said that it's missing the flood myth in an earlier version of the text, it's also missing the kings that supposedly lived before the flood that reigned for like tens of thousands. Like it's a ridiculous number, tens of thousands of years each king. I'm like, it's kind of like the absurdity we see in the Book of Genesis, where this person's living hundreds of years, that person's living hundreds of years.
I think people get.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, it's funny. It's funny to me, hearing people grapple with these texts and attempt to fit them into some sort of naturalistic or scientific model. I mean, I've heard that the Garden of Eden is just sitting there on the bottom of the Persian Gulf, and all that just got filled in, right, with water from the flood. But it just, I mean, on the one hand, when you're doing this kind of stuff, you're misreading the text in such a way that you're missing such important information and details about what the authors are trying to tell us. And as a philologist and as someone who's interested in this literature on a literary level, I mean, that's a tragedy, because this, to my eye, to my ear, is what we should be looking for first with these texts. But then, I mean, have these people ever actually sat down and read through the book of Genesis and really thought about a lot of the stuff that's going on in this book? I think we grow up with these stories, and because we grow up with them, they become so commonplace that they're essentially naturalized. Like, we have ideas about what these, if what this looks like when God plants a garden in Eden to the east, right? Or we have a sense of what this looks like when the fountains of the earth burst forth with water. But if you really sit down and you read the text and you think through what's going on, it's very strange. And what we're missing so often is the strangeness of the text, which is an on the nose, clear indicator of exactly what kind of literature this is. It's weird. Like, there's a lot of strange shit that's going on in the text that you cannot cobble into your naturalistic model of how the world works.
There's also that story of Ehrman Duranka, and he's taken to heaven by Ishkar and Utu. They take him to heaven. It's kind of very similar to what you see of Enoch in the book of Genesis. He's being taken up to heaven too. So it's not just the creation myths that are similar to flood myths that are similar. You have this person over here or that person over here being taken up into heaven by the gods, kind of like what you see in the book of Genesis.
Yeah, and I think this is why, if we back away from myths for a second and talk about something that I think people generally in these discussions find less offensive, maybe, or at least less difficult to take on board. If you go back to, broad cultural things, for example, legal texts that we have, law collections. It's very easy for someone today to, Google the law collection of Hammurabi, the laws of Hammurabi, or the laws of Ornama, or the laws of Lipit-Ishtar, or the laws of Eshnunna, and just read them. Right? And for anybody that's interested, Martha Roth has put together a nice, handy little collection. It's like the law collections of Asia Minor, I think is what it's called. But it's got the Sumerian, the Akkadian, the Hittite, all the laws sort of brought together outside of the Hebrew Bible. And if you read them, you'll notice that there are some places that, boy, it sure seems like there's a lot of really close similarities to what's, being written, for example, in the Covenant Code in Exodus 21, which has led scholars like David Wright to say, no, I think the Covenant Code is actually utilizing quite directly, a section of the laws of Hammurabi. But at least, I think everybody would kind of agree they're all swimming in the same water, right? And as my well, somebody I was supposed to study with when I went to Hopkins, but he passed away. But the great scholar, legal specialist Raymond Westbrook said, the laws today change at a frenetic rate. He says laws are always changing, always changing, always changing. And so I think we anticipate that in the ancient world. We expect, all right, well, gosh, the laws of Hammurabi are written in the 18th century. So, if the Hebrew Bible is, if you're a fundamentalist, like the 15th century or the 14th century or something like that, or, or for, most scholars would say, sometime in the middle of the first millennium. Well, gosh, there's such a large, at a minimum, centuries in between these that the laws must have developed. So, but they don't, right? They move very, very slowly, because the life that people led was quite consistent, right? Their day-to-day lives were just quite consistent, much more so than what we see today with our technological advancements. And so if you read through these law collections, be they from the third, second, or first millennia, and then go to the Hebrew Bible, you'll be like, oh my God, wow, these sound similar. Down to the actual structure of the laws themselves. If X, then Y. And I just think that if we can recognize that type of interplay, where the Israelites are, particularly the Judean scribes, are living in, in the pre-exilic period, they're living at a time when Samaria has been sacked, and you have scribes coming down from the north, and then they're in conversation or interacting in one way or another with those northern traditions, and then of course in Babylonian captivity, all those things get really shaken pretty hard and pressed, and then we can recognize it's a combination of the cultural water that they're all swimming in, then being juiced up on the fact that they're living in that land, seeing that Akitu festival every year. It's just unsurprising, I guess, that you would have this kind of conversation, as Kipp said, which I thought was quite brilliantly said.
So now I want to shift to parallels with the fall of man in the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve. So when you look at, again, we're going to bring up Sitchin again, because Sitchin has created this fictitious parallel where he said Enki created Adamu in Titi, which there's no text where it actually says such a thing. And I think he blamed Enlil for expelling them from the garden. And so he's coming up with these conflating Mesopotamian stuff with biblical stuff and creating this fantasy and calling it a translation. But are there real parallels to Adam and Eve in Mesopotamian literature?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And well, first of all, let's make a correction here, where I think it's a mistake to think of this story as a story of the fall or some sort of moral failure.
I meant to say so-called fall, but yeah.
Oh yeah, good. But yes, exactly. The so-called fall. This is a Christian veneer that's been read back onto this story, which frustratingly has affected just so much of what we see in it, to the point where we can't see what's actually there most of the time. I'm reasonably convinced that there's several echoes from a few different ancient texts that inform this story on a variety of levels. The most obvious one, I think, is probably the way that the progression of this story follows the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Enkidu and his domestication. Essentially, he's a wild man or a wild creature who's created by the gods in order to distract Gilgamesh from making the citizens of Uruk so so miserable, because Gilgamesh is kind of an asshole, certainly at the beginning of this story. Now, and people will read it. They'll read the story of Enkidu and his domestication by the prostitute Shamhat, the way that the story progresses, and how this sexual encounter changes him, makes him aware, and the result of this is that he gets dressed. Shamahat clothes him. The animals, they don't recognize him anymore. They run away from him. And she says to him, "Well, let's go to Uruk, because this is the place where civilized men go." This is all in the background of this story in Genesis, and a lot of these themes are still built into the text. You've got a theme about this connection between knowledge and sex and divinity. That's all part of the story of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life, and what happens when the man and the woman eat from these things. And when you can read the original languages, it's a lot easier. It's clearer to see a lot of this stuff working its way out. But in many respects, something that we also see is a writer, I think a rather brilliant writer. And this is also easily one of my favorite stories in the Bible, just because of how many layers there are to it, and how much it's reflecting on so many different levels, on a variety of themes, and interacting with different traditions and ideas from antiquity. But I think this is very much a story that's in conversation, excuse me, with the Epic of Gilgamesh, but in a different direction, right? This is not the domestication of Enkidu is a step in establishing his humanity, and it's treated in a way, the civilization of a human being from this wild creature is treated as a triumph. This is a positive thing. This is not what happens in the story of the trees in the garden, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, when the human couple eat from them. They're told that they're going to become like gods, which is something else echoed from the story of Enkidu in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But this is a tragedy. Instead of going into the city, the couple have to leave. What's often misunderstood to be like, this is part of this. I think when we think about the Garden of Eden, we're imagining like this untampered wilderness out in the middle of nowhere, that has been untouched by civilization or urbanization. I think it's probably the opposite of that. What's in view is probably like a manicured, manufactured urban garden, a temple garden, something to that effect. So when the couple are exiled, they're pushed out, they're pushed away from the city, and they're sent out to live literally in the wilderness, in the wild country. And this is a theme that then just kind of continues its way, certainly through those first 11 chapters of Genesis. And now I'll shut up for a while, because I've been talking too much.
No, definitely not. And if I could, Jacob, for just a second, I try to never do this, but for some reason I glanced over at the side chat, and there's a
Oh, don't
persistent
do that.
individual. Yeah, but I think they bring up, much to my chagrin, I have to say, they bring up a point that is worth highlighting. They keep saying we are trying to refute the Tanakh, right? We're trying to refute the Hebrew Bible. And I think this is a fundamental, like, this highlights exactly what we're saying, right? Exactly. If you could see Kipp's shirt,
I get back
I
up a little bit there.
yep, I fucking love the
I'm right.
Bible.
There we
Yep.
go, dude.
Awesome.
And you know, this is why this is so bizarre to me, because like I spend my days. Today I was working on my translation of the Enuma Elish. And I don't know that anybody would like accuse me of hating or trying to refute the Enuma Elish if I said that the Enuma Elish is utilizing the Anzu myth in with utilizing intertextuality and having a conversation with that text in order to make a broader, or not a broader, but a more a more precise theological point, a more developed theological point. But the problem here is that they're coming to the text with a preconceived notion about it, that if somebody says that it's not in line with their very precise interpretive framework, inspired by God, absolutely inerrant, handed down from on high in the 15th century or something, that means that the person that's making the statement about it is attempting to refute it, or they hate it, or whatever. And the reality here is that you just don't know what the fuck you're talking about, right? That's the bottom line. Kipp and I love what we do.
Yeah.
And in the same way that I can read the Epic of Gilgamesh and read, where Gilgamesh weeps over Enkidu until the maggot falls out of his nose, and then has this realization that he too is mortal and will one day die, and really appreciate the literary genius behind the use of the earlier Sumerian individual novellas or individual stories about Gilgamesh, and weaving them into this brilliant this brilliant epic that is then later redacted in order to add more theological points, has like to assert that somehow I hate the Epic of Gilgamesh. And of course, no one would do that, right? But it's because nobody's
I did
worshiping.
once. I asserted that Josh hates the
Yeah,
Epic of Gilgamesh.
That's
but
true.
yeah.
That's true.
You're an enemy of Gilgamesh, Josh.
Obviously. So yeah, I think that's an important point, that the individual that's in the side chat is just.
This is pertinent. This is timely. Could I read something? It's not very long, but this came to mind because I was working on this today. This is I'll just read a couple of paragraphs here of how I begin the conclusion in the book that I've just finished writing. So the Bible is a conversation. It's not a conversation ender. It's a conversation that we can enter into. A few weeks ago, before I finished writing this book, I had the privilege to interview David M. Carr, the renowned professor of Hebrew Bible at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Union is the same place where Charles Augustus Briggs taught, the great 19th century biblical scholar who endured a trial for heresy and was excommunicated by the Presbyterian Church of America for his unflinching commitment to the integrity of historical critical scholarship. Professor Carr said this to me as we concluded a delightful conversation about the formation of the Torah and various source theories for its construction. And this really resonates with me. I've been doing critical biblical scholarship for almost my entire adult life. I started this work as an evangelical Christian, training for professional pastoral ministry. I continued and spent the majority of my time at the highest levels of academic study as a still professing Christian who had made peace with the Bible as a thoroughly ordinary human book, a collection of diverse theological, political, mythical, ritual, philosophical, poetical, and historical texts for the promotion of a specific set of ideas about the ancient tribal God of Israel called Yahweh. On this side of my journey, I'm a skeptic, but one who remains completely fascinated by the Bible, its origins and development, its transmission and reception over the course of centuries in the ancient Mediterranean world. When I was a child, my parents purchased for me and my brother a copy of the Picture Bible. It's a graphic novel telling the story of the Bible as a comic strip historical narrative. They also bought for us a large collection of cassette tapes called The Bible in Drama, doing essentially the same thing in the form of radio plays. The images, the dialogue, the sounds, they continue to this day, flashing and echoing in my mind as I turn these texts over and over and over and over again. For all my life, I've been obsessed with the Bible. It has shaped my upbringing, my education, and my career, and that fascination has never waned. It grows with every passing day. I fucking love the Bible. And this is where I feel like Professor Carr's comment hit me. The Bible is a thoroughly ordinary human book that is for everyone. Whether you are aware of it or not, if you are reading this book, you're not, but hopefully you do at some point. If you are reading this book written in English, the Bible has touched your world. Within the English-speaking world, it is almost certainly without argument the most influential work of literature in existence. So while the Bible is an ordinary human book, it's also an undeniably remarkable book. Like Dr. Carr said, it's a conversation. It's a conversation that we all enter into at some point. So this is why Josh and I continue to talk about the Bible, teach the Bible, read the Bible, work through the Bible, translate the Bible. This is all of the reason for us doing what we do. By the way, people should check out my interview with Dr. David Carr on my channel.
It was
It's
amazing.
pretty phenomenal.
Yeah.
I'll put the link to that in the description as well after this video is over.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Yeah. But I want to go back to this Adam thing, and I want to bring up Adapa. Do you both see parallels with Adam and Adapa?
You may go first.
You go.
Yeah, why not?
But we probably both do. Maybe in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, again, like I think we should always. I mean, I think we have been, right. That's what this whole conversation about.
Yeah.
But nuance what we mean by parallels. But certainly, at a minimum, there is a like a mythological theme, a literary theme that has this missed opportunity at eternal life. And like, so for those that don't know, Adapa is Ea's or Enki's sort of one of his main servants on the earth. He's a human that's been taught the sort of the secret lore of divine knowledge in order to do incantations and those sorts of things. And one day he's out fishing for Ea because Ea likes to eat fish. And the south wind blows so hard that it capsizes his boat. And when Adapa comes to the surface, he curses the south wind. And because he's been taught how to manipulate reality through these, these incantations, it actually breaks the wing of the south wind. And so the wind doesn't blow. And after not blowing for a significant period of time, Anu, the sky god, kind of like scratches his head and goes, "Hey, what's the deal with the south wind not blowing?" "Oh, Adapa cursed it and broke its wing." And so he summons him to come to heaven and sort of explain himself. So Ea, realizing what's going to happen when Adapa gets up there, says to him, "Listen, when you get up there, Anu is going to offer, first of all, you're going to see these two figures at the door, dress a certain way, say these certain things, and you'll find favor with them," right? By the way, one of the people there has connections to serpents. And and so he says, "But when you get up there before Anu, he's going to offer you the food and the drink. He's going to offer you clothing. He's going to offer you oil. And he's going to offer you food and drink. You can take the clothing, take the oil, but you can't take the food and the drink because they're the food and drink of death." Right? So Adapa, being the pious servant of Ea, gets up there, does everything that he says, and when Anu offers him this food and this drink, it's actually the food and drink of life. He would have gotten,
he tells him that
immortality.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he says, "No, thank you." And so he it's this missed opportunity and immortality. And Steve Tinney up at University of Pennsylvania has a phenomenal lecture on this. But you see this theme popping up elsewhere. You see it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. As Gilgamesh realizes that he can't go the same route to immortality as the flood survivor did, Utnapishtim, he is allowed to find this plant of life. And so he goes down and he gets it, and instead of consuming it and getting its benefit, he decides he's going to test it out, and he wants to take it back to his city, Uruk, and feed part of it to an old man and see what happens. And on his way back, he stops at a pool to take a bath, and he takes off his clothing and he puts down the plant of life with the clothing, and a snake slithers up and eats the plant of life, sheds its skin as it slithers away. And so again, snake, missed opportunity at immortality via food, right? Eating something. Now, when we think about what the myth is doing, what the story is doing in Genesis 2 and 3, is that there are lots of similarities. The ones that we've just sort of talked about there, right? This missed opportunity at immortality through eating something. I think there's a very good argument to be made that Ea and Yahweh are playing, or Yahweh Elohim in Genesis 2, they're playing very similar roles. They're taking very similar approaches to their subject, right? The person that's under their care, lying to them in order to take care of them, in order to protect what it is that they carry or don't carry, depending on the case that we're talking about. And again, all of this, you have to see all of this in its broader context of what the primeval history is doing in response, as Kipp was talking about, in response to the Mesopotamian way of thinking. And so there's going to be these points of contact, these points of overlap, but the text is making a different, often very contrasting theological point. So polemicizing it, right? And so like that's what I would say just about some of the bits. I mean, if you think, sorry, just very quick, if you think about, and you can talk more about it, Kipp, sorry. But if you think about what Enki does, Enki is ostensibly lies to Adapa and says, that's the food and drink of death, so don't eat it. When in reality, like, Ea certainly knew it wasn't. And I think in the same way, Yahweh says, in the day that you eat of this fruit, you will in fact die. And despite what apologists will do, oh, it's spiritual death. Oh, a day is like 1,000 years. All of this, silly nonsense. I think scholars are going to come down in one of two places with this text. Like it's clear that the text is saying when Adam and Eve would partake of that fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, they would die immediately, and it's a physical death. It's not a spiritual death. So you have a problem. You have an interpretive crux. It's a reason people have been talking about it for 2,500 fucking years, right? So really, there's only two ways that I think most scholars are going to come at this. At least most critical scholars are going to come at this. One is they're going to say this is a maximal punishment that God is choosing in his mercy not to inflict. Fine. Ron Hendel holds that position. I think that's fine. It's not exactly what I think is going on, but whatever. But the other, and Kipp, feel free to take it away, I think is that actually the deity is lying, but this lying was not seen as something immoral to the writer.
Yep, absolutely. I think you and I actually had like a live chat about this with Derek in his basement a couple years ago. But and that's I think that's absolutely right. And there's a couple different levels here where this story of Adapa and this story of or this particular motif, I see it connected more directly to the trees here, right? Is taking place, and I say the trees because in Adapa, Ea lies, or is it's Ea, right? I always get them mixed up.
Mhm.
Yeah, and Enki. Yeah. Ea lies. Enki's the one. Yeah, right. So Ea lies. Ea lies by telling him it's the food of death. Yahweh lies by telling the couple that they're going to die if they eat from the tree of knowledge. And then Adapa discovers Enki offers him water and bread of life, eternal life. But one of the questions that scholars pose with regards to this story in Genesis is what on earth is going on with the tree of life, because it's introduced. I think it's Genesis chapter, or sorry, I think it's verse 10 of Genesis 2. Could be wrong about that, but it's fairly early. It gives the geography, kind of the geographical description of the Garden of Eden, and then it says that it just says the tree that God planted all the trees, and then it says the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life were in the garden also, and then that's the last you hear of it. All the way through, God creates all the animals and brings them to the man, and they're unsuitable, so he creates the woman, and that's good. And then the snake comes and tempts the couple, and they eat from the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Their eyes are opened, just like the snake said, just like did I actually say Satan earlier? I didn't mean to. How did I get lost in my
It's
in my
okay.
words? Did I actually
I don't think so. I thought you said
I
serpent.
hope
but
not. Okay.
it's
All right.
okay.
The serpent. Yes, I did say serpent. So the snake, yeah, so he tells them their eyes are going to be open, and that's what happens. They don't die. This is where the lie is revealed, right? But through this whole story, the tree of life is just missing all the way up until verse 22 of chapter 3. Yahweh comes and discovers that they've eaten from the tree of knowledge, and they have discovered that they're naked and they have to cover up. And then he curses the snake, he curses the woman. He doesn't curse the man, he curses the ground. And then we get this. And actually I have it up here in Genesis chapter 3, verses 22 to 24. See now, the Adam, or the man, has become like one of us. This is Yahweh speaking to the rest of the gods, knowing good and bad. So what prevents that he might stretch his hand and take also from the tree of life, eat and live forever? This is the second time that the tree of life is even mentioned in this story, after it's introduced at the very beginning. So Yahweh God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground. From where he was taken, he drove out the Adam and stationed on the east of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming whirling sword to guard the way of the tree of life. See what I mean about the text being weird? It's weird, guys. But scholars have wondered, and they've asked questions about, like, why is the tree of life so elusive in this story? Some have suggested that that there's textual corruption taking place here, that there was a time when the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil were actually always together through the whole story, and that the tree of life is there. And like, I bring this up because I think this is kind of the crux. This is kind of the point in the story, very similar to what's happening in the myth of Adapa. It's a question of missed immortality, as Josh said. The man and the woman eat from the tree of knowledge, which opens their eyes, and it says that they've become like gods. This was the promise of the serpent. This happens. They're not totally gods yet, though. They're only part of the way there, right? The real problem is that if they now take this final step and eat from the tree of life, then they will be gods. It's the same thing as what was taking place with Adapa. By partaking of the bread and the water of life, he was going to become like a full-fledged god. In my own thinking, the way I like to think about this story is that the reason why there's no mention of the tree of life from the beginning of the story until just this point at the end is because the people can't see it. And then they suddenly realize that it's there, or at least they understand what it is after their eyes were opened. That's part of knowing good and evil, is this recognition. Oh, there's this other tree here that we can partake of and live forever. That's why now there's this sudden urgency on the part of Yahweh to get them out of the garden. But I wanted to. Sorry. I wanted to say one other thing here about. There's something in the myth of Adapa, in the story of Adapa, that I really like, and I think about whenever I think about the man in the Garden of Eden. So when Adapa is introduced, this is what the text says about him. To him he had given wisdom, eternal life he had not given to him. In those days, in those years, the sage from Eridu, Ea created him as the model of men. The sage, his command no one can vitiate. The capable, the most wise among the Anunnaki is he, the blameless of clean hands, the ointment priest, the observer of rites. With the bakers, he does the baking. With the bakers of Eridu, he does the baking. Bread and water for Eridu, daily he provides. With his clean hands, he arranges the offering table. Without him, the table cannot be cleared. He steers the ship. He does the prescribed fishing for Eridu. The point is repeated over and over through this this introduction to this story that Adapa is a very, very useful guy. He's kind of the guy in Iridu. They can't get along without him. Look at all this stuff that he does. I love that. I love that line. Without him, the table cannot be cleared. And I think of that when I think about Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. We're told that they were placed in the garden specifically for the purpose to keep it and to work it, to slave for it. Bruce Wells talks about the couple as oblates, as like temple slaves, basically. Their purpose is looking after this garden. But now that they have attained knowledge, good and evil, now that they are in a position where they can attain eternal life by eating from the tree of life, at this point where they're on the cusp of immortality, there's this sense that they can no longer fulfill this function as simple oblates, as slaves within the garden. So there's almost a sense like they had to get them out, because they had no purpose anymore in the garden, and we're all as humankinds in this awkward state, between the gods and the slaves. So it's yeah. Okay, I'm shutting up now.
When was the book of Genesis actually written?
Oh, what do you mean by that, dude?
There's the $64,000 question.
Right? So what are we talking about? Where are we talking about? Yeah, okay. So you want to start, Josh, or do you want me to start?
Yeah, I mean, it really kind of does depend if you're talking about like the final canonical form. I mean, even there, we don't know. There are different theories about it. So I guess maybe the thing to do is to talk about maybe some of the big ways that people view that. So, people that hold to what would be called the documentary hypothesis or the neo-documentary hypothesis, which, by the way, is just vastly more complicated than I think. And in some ways much simpler, actually, than what apologists like to think and argue. The apologists don't really understand what's going on with it, and so they set up straw men that they don't realize they're doing. But
right.
I think that you would posit, if you did try to assign dates or rough dates to them, you've got an earlier source that's maybe coming in like the 8th century. I mean, I think early on we were thinking 10th century, but who knows? But that and then as time goes by, you get J and E. They're written pre-exilic period theoretically. Then Deuteronomy or the Deuteronomist is penned sometime in the 7th century, maybe at least the core 12 to 26 of it is penned at that time, and then the priestly writer is exilic, maybe post-exilic. But that's sort of, and is there a separate redactor that's bringing all those sources together? Again, this is not my area of specialization, so please, definitely I, defer to a David Carr or Joel Baden or somebody. But the other sort of mainline view that is certainly more held, or more commonly held in Europe, would be a view that says that you have independent blocks of text that are developing on their own. So you have the patriarchal narrative, that's developing in Genesis by itself as a block of text. It's been brought together by smaller bits, and it's come together and it's developing as time goes by. And then you have this separate origin story of the nation of Israel with their sojourn in Egypt, or this time they're coming up out of Egypt, and then Moses delivers them, and then they wander. And that only at a later time, maybe during the exile or post-exilic period, whatever. Again, lots of different theories, lots of different ideas. These two get brought together. Conrad Schmidt has a phenomenal book talking about one particular view that he espouses, and I think he makes a really good argument for a lot of the things that he's talking about in his view, obviously, of wedding the patriarchal narrative and the Exodus story together. But yeah, the point, I suppose, the broad point is that if we're talking about as the text developed, throughout the first millennium at most, you may have some earlier bits like the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15 that maybe go back to the early Iron Age.
Blessing in Genesis,
right?
49 is probably pretty early.
Judges 5. Yeah, that sort
of
thing.
Even just within Genesis, Esther Humori has made I think a pretty good case that the two true theophanies in Genesis chapter 18 when Yahweh visits Abraham, and then when Jacob wrestles with God, she's made a pretty convincing case, I think, that these are old stories that go well back into the Iron Age. But and there's a lot of this is the tricky thing with a text like Genesis, just because there's so much going on in there. And you can still see like pieces of more into, like the Joseph cycle is kind of one that the scholars will point to as something that developed separately and then was eventually sort of woven in and incorporated into this text. But we also have examples of what I think are some pretty late, really late stuff in the book of Genesis. The story of the very, very brief little bit to begin the story of the flood. It sets it up with the sons of God coming down and having sex with the daughters of men. This is something we know in elaborate detail from the book of Enoch, which dates to the 3rd century. So, I mean, what is Genesis doing? I don't think it's abridging Enoch by any stretch of the imagination, but is this kind of an open question that's being bandied about? Is this a tradition that people are playing around with in the Persian period? And then you've got something like the story of the Tower of Babel, which I think pretty clearly, and you can make very close literary connections to a monument that was erected by Nebuchadnezzar II to commemorate his completion of Etem and Enki, the foundation platform of the heaven and the earth. It's one of the temples that was one of the great temples that was in Babylon, and that happened in 590 BCE. So later than that, right? But then you've got things like Josh has mentioned the Sumerian Kings List, which comes to us in a variety of different forms from over a long period of time, when you look at the listing, the first genealogy, I guess, in Genesis chapter 5, this is the one with all the long ages of the pre-Diluvian patriarchs, antediluvian. What is that? What do we call them again? I don't remember how this works.
Antediluvian.
Yeah, all the antediluvian patriarchs. So when you look at all the long ages, there's a pretty interesting case that's been made to show that I mean, everybody agrees these are formulaic on some level. There's complicated mathematical formulas that have been sorted out to show exactly the relationship and the pattern between these ages. And there's I don't remember who wrote it, but it was written back in the 90s, I think. A really interesting article about how when you look at the ages of the patriarch of these antediluvian patriarchs, and you break them down into the number of months that correspond to the number of years, and then you compare that to not just the Sumerian Kings List, but Berosus's version of the Sumerian Kings List. Berosus is writing in the 3rd century, but when you look at those two, there is literally a 1-for-1 correspondence in terms of the breakdown of the time from the beginning of creation to the time of the flood. It's calculated a little bit differently because the writer of the book of Genesis, here's another thing. The writer of the book of Genesis is engaging in calendar questions. It looks like this text in Genesis 5 is written according to a solar calendar. These are the sorts of questions that people are really, really concerned about in the Hellenistic period. So, but when you break it down and you look at it, it's a 1-to-1 correspondence in terms of the alignment of this calendar in Genesis 5 with Berosus's version of the Sumerian Kings List, and only Berosus's version. So what do we do with stuff like that? It certainly looks like the book of Genesis as we have it now is really late. And there's stuff in there that people were still at least playing around with pretty liberally. Maybe as late as the 3rd century, the 2nd century. I don't know, but I think it's an interesting question.
Gianna Roman, thank you for your super sticker. Appreciate it. Hope I pronounced your name correctly. And there's somebody in the chat asking, why won't y'all debate Frank Turek?
Oh, please, can
Yeah,
we debate Frank Turek?
Set it up.
Just
Set it
please
up.
bring him. I'm happy to do that.
I think you should. Yeah, I think you should ask Frank Turek why he wouldn't debate us, or anybody else that has.
Oh, nobody wants to listen. We
agree.
try. We really, honestly, sincerely try.
We've been
to get
emailing.
people's attention.
Yeah, Stuart and Cliff Connectley recently.
No,
and we have
nobody
a
wants to
decent
talk to us, you
relationship with
guys.
them. I've debated the Connectleys, I think 3 times now, but we can't. But
Nope.
anyway,
they got big and famous, and they won't.
Yep.
They won't talk to Josh anymore.
So one last thing I want to ask before we close is which resources would y'all recommend for the audience to gain real credible access to Mesopotamian text so they can avoid and dodge all the pseudo nonsense that they see on the internet?
So I would recommend 2 things. The first is a Sumerian a source for Sumerian literary texts, and it's online. It's totally free. It's down right now, unfortunately. Like for the past 30 minutes, it's been down, which is frustrating. So I wanted to look at something, but it's called the Electronic. It's a very creative name. The Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, but ETCSL. So if you Google ETCSL Sumerian, it will pop up. But it has essentially all of Sumerian literary texts that we had as of 2005, I think, in both transliteration, so you can see the actual Sumerian, what the Sumerian transliteration says, and in English translation. So that's one place. There's another website called ORAC, the Openly Rich Akkadian, I don't know, ORACC. I can never remember what these things stand for. But that is a tremendous site that will give you all kinds of Akkadian texts and links to other sites. But if you're looking for a really easy sort of one-stop shop to Akkadian literary texts, myths, those sorts of things, Benjamin Foster in 2005 published, I think it's his updated edition of it, but of Before the Muses. I think the subtitle is an Akkadian anthology or an anthology of Akkadian literature or something like that. But ETCSL for Sumerian texts, and then Benjamin Foster's Before the Muses for Akkadian texts. Or, of course, you can go to digitalhammurabi.com, and Megan, my wife, who is an Assyriologist, who is also Bart Ehrman's podcast host, if anybody doesn't know that. She does all things ancient Sumerian and Akkadian. So she and I wrote a Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian grammar, which is somewhere on a shelf behind me. But
you guys
sorry, go ahead.
No, you finish.
I was just going to say our YouTube channel, or her YouTube channel, is just chock full of her reading the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Numa Elish, or summarizing Akkadian and Sumerian texts. We discuss them. So yeah, that's what she does, is what we do. So
yeah, I was gonna say you guys could also just buy the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, volumes 1 and 2, which deals pretty comprehensively with a lot of the relationships between ancient Near Eastern texts and the Hebrew Bible texts. So yeah, I mean, you could do that as well. I was going to recommend David Carr's book, but it's super expensive, so I won't. But yeah, which is a shame. It's sad that books are so much money.
I'll have the links to everything y'all mentioned in the description below. And we do have a super chat question that somebody got in here, so we'll take that real quick before we close. Chuck KV, thank you for your super chat. Does the God of Genesis or its Near Eastern cousin text have a beard? And of the three I see on the screen, which does the text best support as the one true beard?
Oh my god, I think there's no. I just don't think there's any question here. Is there? It's the beard, and I see 4 of us on the screen. I don't know about you guys, but Josh's beard is a persona unto itself. It's like the divinity over there. It's Josh and his beard.
It's my lapis lazuli beard. Yeah. That's what it is. I am Gilgamesh. That's what I'm going for, the Gilgamesh look.
Yeah. You're killing it, dude.
Just to remind everybody, I have the link to Joshua's YouTube channel tagged in the description below, and also Kipp's YouTube channel tagged in the description below. So if you're not subscribed to their channels, you can click on those tags and subscribe now. And that being said, Josh and Kipp, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel.
Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.